Hello, Chris.
Hi.
Now, I always love hearing how bombshells land on the political editor's phone. So how did the bombshell of John Healey's resignation as Defence Secretary mid-morning on Thursday land?
So I had just finished writing a piece for the BBC News website and app along the lines...
About John Healey's bright future?
No, but it was about the Defence Investment Plan, because I've been talking about it on the Today programme, and it was obvious that there was one heck of a row going on within government and within the military around the numbers, and basically they just couldn't come to an agreement on the numbers. That was obvious. What wasn't was that the Defence Secretary would do what he did, and do what he did in the context of politics right now. And then, Adam, you have this I have this sort of sense of moments like this shouldn't feel normal as a political reporter, but they've started to be honest, because of the resignations that we've had in the last month, 6 in total amongst ministers, 2 from the cabinet, and then with the prospect of whatever might happen the other side of that by-election in Makerfield in the northwest of England in a week's time.
My first impression was that it was a quite old school resignation, in that it was over just a clear disagreement about a particular policy, as opposed to disagreement with the direction of the government or Keir Starmer's leadership. It was actually it reminded me a bit of when Ian Duncan Smith resigned from David Cameron's government because George Osborne wanted to cut benefits and he didn't want to deliver that cut because he thought it was bad.
Yeah, it was, in that sense, a policy disagreement. It wasn't a scandal involving anyone or anything. It wasn't, as you say, at least directly a wider critique, although there are parallels in the critique that John Healey has made in his departure that you can draw with other departures from the government. But yeah, here is this central bit of government policy, central challenge for this government, so many governments in the Western world, no doubt the successor to this government, successors of all sorts of political stripes to this government around how you crank up defence spending and the trade-offs that come with it. And that's the big picture disagreement that's at the heart of this.
But just in terms of where we are in the chronology, Chris, so the little reminiscence we had there was about mid-morning on Thursday. John Healey resigned and he posted his resignation letter on X, and it's a very interesting letter, which we will go through paragraph by paragraph because it reveals quite a lot of stuff. Then just before you and I sat down to record this, we got the traditional reply from the Prime Minister.
We did. There was about a 6-hour window between the two.
Because normally the letters get swapped quite quickly, don't they?
Yeah, and as we're recording at 6:30-ish on, what day is it? Thursday evening, and this may be overtaken by events by the time newscasters are listening to our conversation, we still don't have a new Defence Secretary. And you can't leave a post like that empty for that long, I don't think, because of the very nature of it, because you sit at the apex alongside the Prime Minister of the decision-making tree around the defence of the realm, the defence of the country. So I suspect in the next few hours they'll try to find a Defence Secretary, but it's not outwardly a wildly appealing job when you have the kind of smoking ruin of this defence investment plan and any incoming Defence Secretary wondering about how long the boss is going to last.
Yeah. Let's talk about John Healey's letter in a second, but just before we do, just a few terms. We've already talked about the Defence Investment Plan, the DIP.
Yes.
That is this financial plan for the military for the next few years, running into the tens of billions potentially, which will both deal with increases in costs for things that the MOD were already doing anyway, so inflation and rising costs, but also to implement the defence review, which was done for the government last year.
Exactly.
About the future of what our armed forces looks like.
Exactly. So the Defence Review was done and published pretty much a year ago. Then there was the whole business of how you pay for it. And there's all sorts and a huge level of complexity and detail here. But the big picture is one of the kind of obvious international backdrop and a widespread sense that countries like ours need to spend more on defence. A commitment that the government has made to NATO, to the Defence Alliance, to get to 3.5% of our national income being spent on core defence, as it's described, by 2035. The government's promised to get to 2.5% by April of next year, and the idea being obviously that it ratchets up to hit that longer term target in the years between next year and the middle of the next decade. And you're talking about big numbers here. You're talking about tens of billions, and defence spending as a proportion of the economy getting back in the direction of kind of shares of the economy that it was quite a long time ago. And in the post-Cold War era, people have talked about a peace dividend, about taxpayers' money being able to be spent on other stuff because not as much needed to be spent, so was the calculation, on defence, and so money could be spent on the health service or on schools or whatever any government chose to, or a lower tax burden, for instance. And here this government confronts a high tax burden for all the reasons we've kicked around on Newscast by historic proportions on average, all of the pressures there are on other public services, and this massive additional desire to spend on defence. And that's the crunch point that this defence investment plan was thrashing through. There was clearly the disagreement that I was trying to report on the Today programme this morning, not realising that we were just hours away from the whole thing going getting rather bigger.
Okay, and we're seconds away from Shashank from The Economist being here. Hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Give me your instant reaction, Shashank, to when you heard that John Healey was going.
I was both shocked and not shocked. Shocked in that, this is an incredibly loyal minister who's stuck with the Prime Minister through thick and thin and has been, not even a hint of rebellion in public. But also not shocked in that I've seen the fact that the dip had become a laughingstock in military circles, how much frustration, even anger there was in the private sector, in the military. And so something had to give. And if the Prime Minister hadn't found the funds to get this over the line by now, he wasn't going to find it. And therefore, as something like this reckoning was coming anyway.
Right, let's go through John Healey's letter because it reveals quite a lot of things. So I think if I start with paragraph 1, 2, 3, I've printed it off. Paragraph 5. He says, this new era for defence required further investment through the Defence Investment Plan, as discussed. The excellent and extensive cross-government work that completed in January, overseen by you, me and the Chancellor, confirmed the scale of the challenge and the rising demands on defence. Now, why that's interesting to me is that this was almost like a done deal, almost in January. And they agreed what they needed to do in January, but it's taken till now for them to fall out this spectacularly, and it's taken a long time. It's been rumbling away, Chris, for a while.
It has, yeah, it has. But and we've been anticipating this defence investment plan for ages, and it was forever sort of pushed back, and it was pushed back for all the reasons that are now in clear daylight and have been increasingly clear to those of us prodding and poking around the Ministry of Defence and elsewhere in government, which is back to our old friend trade-offs, and then the scale of those trade-offs, given the scale of additional money that the government outwardly has said it wants to put into defence. And then the arguments that have been going on between John Healey and the Treasury and Downing Street, both the Treasury and Downing Street, as we record, pretty bruised by all of this, as you'd expect, given
because then
what's happened.
Then the next sentence says, since then, you, Keir Starmer, have been unable, and the Treasury has been unwilling to commit the resources that the nation needs to defend the country at this time of rising threats. In other words, Treasury are wrong, Prime Minister, you're useless, and the combined effect is that Britain is less safe.
Yeah, and the argument that you hear back from folk in Downing Street and folk in the Treasury as they talk about that, you'll be familiar with this line, the biggest uplift in spending on defence since the end of the Cold War, and an argument that says, look, we were still talking, we were still debating, we were trying to make this happen. But in the end, obviously, the exasperation for John Healey has boiled over. And I think that line in particular, the unable and unwilling line, that has a political zing to it because obviously it's referring specifically to defence, but it has parallels with a critique, firstly, that I've heard frequently in public from ministers for months, in private from ministers for months, and increasingly in the last month or so since those elections, we've heard from departing ministers in other parts of government. In other words, a critique from those who have served within government that the government of Keir Starmer, in the end, is failing to deliver.
Oh, I've got the news on in the studio for once because I've left the TV on, and Donald Trump has cancelled his planned strikes against Iran that he was threatening to do tonight. So some other defence news just breaking as we're recording this episode. Could do a whole other episode about that. But let's stick with the subject we've got in hand right now. Shashank, this is where it starts to get into number wang. But is it true that the MOD and John Healey, the number that they wanted from the Treasury and Downing Street was about £28 billion over sort of 3-4 years?
That was the case, but my understanding is that had come significantly down as other savings were found in the budget, and that figure had come down, down to 18 billion or so. So there's still a gap, but it was a much narrower gap than some of those gigantic numbers we were hearing just a few months ago. I think the other thing that I understand is that part of where this additional money has been found is that there's a pot of money in the MOD budget that is ring fenced in certain areas because it's ring fenced in case there are additional demands on funding Ukraine. And so the MOD wasn't allowed to shift that money. It was a contingency. And what's happened is the Treasury has taken on some of that risk instead of leaving it inside MOD. And that's produced some of the extra cash. So when you hear phrases like Treasury trickery, I think is one of the phrases I saw in the reporting today.
Used by an ally of John Healey when they were talking about the figures he was presented with.
Yeah. So actually, I'm not sure how fair that is. I think there's an element of real efforts to try to take risk off MOD. But having said that, yes, ultimately there was still a chasm. Now, I think what we don't know, and I've got to stress this, is we don't know where the up and down arrows are on different bits of the budget, because it's entirely possible this budget could be very good for some things, like a hybrid Royal Navy with more drones, and it could be very bad for other things like, carrier strike or the army. And until we see the details published next week, until we see where these cuts are falling and where the gains are falling, we may know this isn't enough to do everything the chiefs wanted, but we won't really have a sense as to what choices have been made. And for me, that's always what this was about. It's about what are you prioritizing, what are you deprioritizing.
Well, and also if it's transformational to our armed forces, or is it just more of the same stuff we've already got?
Exactly, because you could have, all of that 18 billion spent, every penny of it spent on exactly the same forces that you would have had in your budget 5 years ago prior to Ukraine. Or you could imagine significant cuts to certain legacy forces, which would have a pretty rough impact on those forces. But some of that money would go into capabilities that would be very emerging and novel. Now, the other problem in all of this is a timeline. A lot of the really totemic capabilities, like the GCAP program, the sixth generation fighter jet, those are very important for jobs, very important for the aerospace industry, and very, very important for diplomacy, because, of course, we're building that program with Japan, and the Prime Minister of Japan is on her way to the UK just now. But if you talk to some people, they'll say, well, GCAP would not have yielded a useful military capability until well into the 2030s, well after the Russian threat is significant by the end of the decade. So there's a quarrel here, not just about money, overall money and pots of money, and not just about drones versus tanks, but also about the right time horizon on which you need to spend. And you can't understand this debate without really factoring that in as well.
And on top of that, and absolutely all of the detail is key here, and detail we don't yet have because obviously this thing has not yet been published, is an asymmetry, and this often happens when you get a cabinet resignation, an asymmetry in the timeline of things coming into the public domain. In other words, a departing minister will leave with a critique and a sketching out of the numbers as they present them, etc., etc. Speaking to other folks still in government tonight around all of this, as I say, including some who do feel, as is often the case in these situations, wounded by what has happened. They're also limited in what they are able to say publicly in response because this document is still not out there. And of course, given the nature of what has just happened, how much of it that may have only been, was in theory, as far as Downing Street saw it, only days away from seeing the light of day. How long is it until it does, given what we've just seen.
Yeah, the departing minister always gets a sort of moment in the sun. But I suppose we got a hint about what the government wants to say publicly about this, because, Chris, we then got Keir Starmer's response to John Healey's letter.
We did.
So I'm now jumping to another letter before I then jump back to John Healey's original letter. So this is like an epistolary novel.
It is, and a test for how quick it takes your laptop to open a PDF file. But I've just opened up the Prime Minister's letter that we got at about 20 past 6, I think, on Thursday evening. And by the standard of these things, you become something, doing the job that I do, you become something of a scholar of the returns of letters when ministers depart. And by the standards of these things, it's quite perfunctory. It's not oozing in warmth.
It doesn't end with, and I look forward to your long career in politics and maybe you coming back.
No, which sometimes these things do, or sometimes they're all handwritten or whatever. There's a handwritten Dear John and a handwritten Keir, but beyond that, I think what does it do? It sets out, I don't know if you want to do the paragraph by paragraph textual analysis here, Adam, but effectively what it sets out is a kind of précis of what the Prime Minister says the government has achieved in terms of defence, and talking about Ukraine and talking about the Strait of Hormuz. And then he
Paragraph
says...
4 is the key one, I would say.
let me do my counting.
Bottom of page 1.
We are backing this... I see, yeah. So he talks about the Defence Investment Plan doing what he thinks it is necessary for it to do, quote, delivering an unprecedented increase in defence spending in a sustainable way. That's a reference to the trade-offs and also a reference to, if you were to, as he might see it, either overtax or overborrow to pay for something, then that might not be politically savvy. He says the increases in spending that underpin this plan will be sustainable and fair. They will mean significant reallocations of funding from across government departments and the right choices to protect our nation, which translates as this plan did involve cuts to other departments for the benefit of defence. And then he says strong public finances are part of what keeps us safe. Irresponsible borrowing only puts that at risk. There is definitely a pushback from the Prime Minister around that sense of safety, because John Healey was talking about a sense that the plan could leave the UK unsafe. But yes, the final lines: taking these decisions is never easy. I'm determined to rebuild our country after years of being buffeted by crises. I am sorry that you will not be part of that work going forward. So, yeah, there you go.
Goodbye and good night. Right, Shashank, let's go back to John Healey's letter, the first letter we're looking at. And I've lost track of which paragraph it is, but there's one about where he just talks about the trajectory for defence spending in the next decade or so, which Chris alluded to just before you came onto Newscast. Just talk us through the numbers that are being tossed around there.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing here is how specific he is. It's a very, speaking of sort of passing the language, what we saw from Healey is that he says, look, it's good that we've, got to 2.6%, next year. But he's saying by the end of the decade, then, if you cast forward to 2030, just before you get to 2030, you would be at 2.68% of GDP. And, that's pretty feeble. And it's feeble because the government sitting at the NATO summit last summer, the Prime Minister at The Hague, I was there. I saw Donald Trump brandishing a phone with Emmanuel Macron's text messages on it. And of course, Mark Rutte's famous text messages. He signed up to saying we will be spending 3.5% of GDP on core defence, plus another 1.5%, of course, on related stuff by 2035. So if you've gone up, there's two problems here. First of all, you're barely going up between now and the end of the decade. There's
by 0.08 percentage points.
Yeah, it's pathetic. It's hardly anything. So it's all backloaded. And not only is it backloaded, but in the next parliament. So there's no obligation on this government. You can't bind a future parliament. And then in that next parliament, when will that kick up the 3.5%, 3 to 3.5? Well, the answer is nobody knows. And if it's all the way to 2034, are we supposed to believe that this government's going to go from, or the next government will go from 3% and to 3.5%, 0.5% of GDP, which is an enormous sum of money, of course, in the space of a year? That's completely preposterous.
It's just
therefore, it gives rise to the view that the Hague Commitment is a nonsense.
And just to remind people, we're talking about spending on defence as a percentage of the overall country's economy. This isn't about 3.5% of the government's budget. This is 3.5% compared to the whole economy. So that's why it's such huge sums, even though the actual percentage increases don't sound like huge numbers. It all works out as when you apply it to the whole economy. Chris, and I mean, that is quite damning, that paragraph, isn't it? Because then John Healey links that to the Prime Minister sort of not sticking to his word and the word that he sort of gave to the whole world.
Completely that.
Or at least all the NATO members.
Completely that. And that sense that it just wasn't a credible plan, that it wasn't believable, and that it was, beyond the extent of this Parliament, and therefore could easily be seen as kind of pie in the sky and just not amounting to a credible programme to deliver the very promise that the Prime Minister committed to at that NATO summit in The Hague of a year ago, and just weeks before the next annual NATO summit, which is in Ankara in Turkey in about 3 weeks' time. And from Mr. Healey's perspective, there's been a lot of focus politically on next Thursday because of the small matter of that by-election. Mr. Healey was due to be, as Defence Secretary, going to NATO HQ in Brussels this time next week, for a meeting of defence ministers from NATO member countries. And I guess ideally he would have liked to have been going there with something that he believed in. And, and I guess for a departing minister wrestling with the conscience question of whether or not you can live with something and look into the eyes of your opposite numbers around a table, et cetera, as well as the people within the building in the Ministry of Defence, a factor that will have been in his mind, no doubt.
And also, he was meant to be doing a news conference and a visit with his Australian counterpart, who had flown from Australia to Britain today, and those events didn't happen.
Well, they went on a morning run this morning, which is something of a tradition between the two of them, and there was photos of that on social media. And I hear that the travelling Australian press pack, delighting in the English summer of pouring rain on June the 11th, were on a train to Portsmouth, anticipating this moment of the respective defence secretaries talking about all things UK and Australian defence. And you might remember on Newscast our discussions about AUKUS, the deal between the UK, Australia and America around joint military programmes, only for said Aussie press pack to discover that the whole thing was binned because the host, or at least the original event was binned because the host, John Healey, had walked the plank.
Now, Shashank, I can imagine a scene where Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is considering all of this, and she says to her officials, bring me a list of all the MOD's big prestige projects they've done for the last 30 years, and put a tick next to the ones that have gone massively over budget, ended up costing way more than people expected, didn't deliver as much as people expected, had bits falling off, or I don't know, made soldiers sick when they rode in the armoured vehicle that we'd spent loads of money on. And I imagine the list would be quite long and there'd be a lot of ticks next to things that hadn't gone well when it came to spending money. Is that a realistic scenario I've just pictured there?
I think you've had a bug in the Treasury, clearly, because I think that's a verbatim transcript of what's probably been said. And you'd be right, of course, we can all name Ajax and carriers and other things that have gone over budget. These are big capital intensive programs. I'm not sure, by the way, defence is always worse than every other part of British life when it comes to big capital intensive multi-decade projects, but that's a separate point. I think my response to that would be to say the answer is reform the way this is done. And that's what was done last year. We had a defence review. It was conducted by external reviewers at great cost and over many, many months. It took months to agree, about 6 months to agree, when it was drafted finally to when it was accepted. And that envisaged reforms to the way defence was organised. You had, for example, a new National Armaments Director appointed who came from the outside. This is someone who oversees lots of big procurement projects. You had something called a Military Strategic Headquarters, MSHQ. All sorts of procurement reforms and acquisition reforms, exactly to address the problems you describe. So my question to government would be as a government, you have overhauled defence last year. You told me how wonderful those reforms were. And now I'm supposed to believe that the reforms are so minimal and cursory that the Defence Department still can't be trusted with money. So what's happened here? Was the review bunk? Were the reforms made up or fabricated? Or in fact, are we kind of getting, relying on old stories to justify a lack of spending? And that's my concern. We've forgotten everything that happened last year.
And Chris, I remember chatting to Fiona Hill, one of the people who was doing the defence review, because she came on Newscast the day it was published, and it was a really interesting chat, as conversations with Fiona Hill always are. And I remember her talking about things like, we need to have a big national conversation to change our mindset about what defence is in 2026. And I made a joke about you're saying we need to bring back Dad's army. And she said, no, I don't mean that, but we need a conversation where every citizen realises they've got a bit of a role to play here. And we haven't had any of that, have we?
No, and I think this will be, if the arc of the conversation around, countries like the UK and their defence posture in the next couple of decades follows the trajectory that many think it will. In other words, heading towards governments attempting to get to those targets by the mid-2030s, etc., etc. You can see this being a kind of early chapter title in that story, because there's so many people I've talked to around Westminster and beyond in the last couple of years, in fact more than a couple of years, around exactly that. That sense of having to have a sustained national conversation around all these huge trade-offs, because otherwise, frankly, you won't win the political argument. You have to do that within political parties, but beyond political parties, to try and make that case. And perhaps this, alongside the if you like, the what seems like more micro or short-term politics that this is taking place in the context of, that John Healey's resignation is a symptom of that, and perhaps the lack of clarity around that debate made both within and beyond the Labour Party.
And Chris, in terms of politics, at the start of the week, Starmer's friends were let it being known that he would stand and fight in any leadership contest. Not that one's been triggered yet, but and they were feeling quite chipper because of things like Andy Burnham had done that interview on Newsnight with Victoria Derbyshire, which some people interpreted as him not knowing what the fiscal rules were in the Treasury. And it felt like Starmer's team had a little bit more oomph this week than they did in previous weeks. What does this do to the oomph levels in Downing Street?
Well, I think the by-election campaign in Makerfield has, for the last couple of weeks, put something of a cork in the bottle of that story that we were telling on Newscast of a couple of weeks ago, when there were the resignations and there was talk of whether an MP would get 81 MPs in order to challenge the Prime Minister and all that kind of stuff. And then Andy Burnham finds a seat that he can fight, and a by-election campaign gets underway. And let me point newscasters in the direction of the full list of candidates on the BBC News website. And things felt like they had returned to a brief period of vague normality at Westminster, where you had the Prime Minister trying to outwardly project a sense of getting on with the job. And by the way, trying to get this out of the door was a case study in trying to do precisely that, alongside what we're expecting about social media for younger people and clamp down on that, perhaps coming early next week. But where there was this, as I say, cork in the bottle that was almost sort of repressing that wider conversation, because there was a recognition within the Labour Party that it couldn't properly resume until the by-election had either returned Andy Burnham to Westminster or hadn't, and then the party could resume the conversation in the light of those circumstances. I think in reality, a already very weak Prime Minister has been weakened further by this. I think if it wasn't for the by-election, certainly what I'm picking up from Labour MPs is that it wasn't for the by-election, we'd be in the zone, if we hadn't been already, around how long he would stick around for, etc., etc. And it clearly, everything else being equal, weakens that argument about, his desire to press on, etc., etc., because one of the conditions of even being able to vaguely contemplate that, I think, was him managing to hold the cabinet together. Now, the loss of one cabinet minister is not necessarily instantly terminal, but it's off the back of the loss of West Streeting. It's with this countdown to Makerfield a week away, and that heightened sense I'm picking up as we chat that, we get the other side of that by-election, and irrespective of outcome, we're straight back to where we were a month or so ish ago, with a raging conversation about who might soon be our new Prime Minister.
And because the Makerfield by-election is slightly strange for reasons we've discussed many times, I'm sure Robert Kenyon, the Reform UK candidate, will be asked what he thinks about the Defence Investment Plan and which areas of capital spending in other government departments should be cut to pay for it next time he does a phone-in or appears on BBC Radio Manchester. So, Chris, thank you very much.
Ta.
And Shashank, thanks to you too.
Thanks so much.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. A reminder, you can listen to us every single day of the week as a podcast, and you can download us from BBC Sounds. And we'll be back with another episode very soon. Bye-bye.